We have here a prominent guest from United States. It's Stephen Levitsky, David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. And I think it's for the first time in 10 years, 20 years that you don't go to the LASA conference, the Conference of Latin American State Associations, because he was going to come to Sweden. And we are very happy.
I was promised good weather. And
Yeah. This is the marketing to attract professors from Harvard. So we're very happy to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Welcome, definitely. Well, you have all heard about Stephen Levitsky, but he has published a lot of books. For example, Transformation Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism in Comparative Perspective, Argentine Democracy, the Bodies of Institutional Weakness, Informal Institutions and Democracy, Lessons from Latin America, and more recently, How Democracies Die, that has been a lot written about this book in the United States. So the theme of today's lecture is Populist and Competitive Authoritarianism in Latin America, which I think is related to all these things that you published in your recent book, perhaps. So it would be delightful to listen about this. And we also want to welcome Maria Therese Gustafsson, postdoctoral research fellow of the Department of Political Science, also an expert in Latin America, and a very good friend of this institute. So very welcome for you too. Well, let's give the word to our guest. Thank you very much, and we say an applause to our guest.
Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to the Institute for having me here, and also to Maria Teresa, who made this visit happen, and even back in January promised that we would have good weather in May. So I don't know what this means for June and July, but good weather for now.
It might snow.
Yes. So I'm going to talk about competitive authoritarianism in Latin America, but I want to start by swerving a little bit and talking about, just for a couple of minutes, about democracy worldwide. There is a virtual consensus today, and I apologize that I'm speaking in English. I guess I could speak in Spanish, but my Swedish is really, really very weak. So there's pretty much a consensus today, at least in the United States, that we're experiencing a worldwide democratic recession. Everywhere you look, liberal democracy seems to be in retreat, whether it's Russia, Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela. And the first thing, just in setting up the context, that I want to argue is that that's actually not true. Empirically, the level of democracy in the world has remained pretty stable over the last decade, and it remains much higher today than at any other time in history, certainly more than the 1990s. The American Freedom House, the American NGO Freedom House, sort of center-right NGO, has spent the last decade telling us that the world is experiencing a great rollback of democracy and the resurgence of authoritarianism across the globe. But if you look at Freedom House's own numbers, it's not really so clear. So in 1995, Freedom House scored 76 countries in the world as free, which you can use as a measure of democracy. In 2005, it scored 89 countries as free. In 2006, the number climbed to 90 free countries. 2006 is widely viewed, at least among the experts, as kind of the peak year of global democratization. That's the year that the decline supposedly began. So after 12 years of democratic rollback, democratic recession, authoritarian resurgence, how many countries do you think Freedom House scored as free last year? 90 at the peak. Last year, 88. That's a decline of 2 relative to peak democratization. Still 12 more democracies than back in 1995. In 2005, Freedom House classified 46% of the world's countries as democracies, or as free. Today, it classifies 45% of the world as free. That is hardly a global democratic meltdown. Now, Freedom House is the most negative. Another leading democracy index, Polity 4, provides even less evidence of a democratic recession. A country with a Polity 4 score of 8 or more can be considered solidly democratic. By that measure, Polity 4 scored 46 countries as democracies in 1990, 58 countries as democracies in 2000, and in 2006, the peak year of democratization, Polity 4 scored 70 countries as democracies. Last year, after a decade of global democratic recession and rollback, authoritarian resurgence, exactly the same number, 70 democracies. So if we step back and look at the big picture, the pattern is pretty clear. There was a dramatic increase in the number of democracies in the world between 1980 and 2005. Since 2005, the level of democracy in the world has been pretty stable. It's basically been a flat line. There have been a few very prominent cases of democratic backsliding in the last decade: Venezuela, Thailand, Turkey, Hungary. There's also been roughly similar number of democratic advances over the last decade: Tunisia, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Senegal, the Gambia. Democratic conditions clearly have deteriorated in Honduras, in Bolivia, Nicaragua, Poland, the Philippines, but they've improved in Colombia, and Guatemala, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and now more recently Armenia and Malaysia. The backsliders, the Venezuelas and the Hungaries and the Turkeys, get much more attention in the media, and they stick in our mind much more than the forward movers. But in net terms, overall, the number of democracies in the world has changed very little over the last decade. I think that's also true in Latin America. I think that's very important to keep in mind, kind of as background. Okay, all of that said, the Andean region has in fact experienced a fair amount of competitive authoritarianism over the last 20 years or so. Peru was the great pioneer in the 1990s. Venezuela, Ecuador, more arguably Bolivia followed suit in the last decade. By competitive authoritarianism, I mean a civilian political regime in which democratic institutions exist and are meaningful, but in which incumbent abuse of state institutions so tilts the playing field that the opposition's ability to compete is seriously compromised. So unlike full-scale dictatorships, unlike old-fashioned dictatorships, competitive authoritarianism permits real competition. The opposition is legal, the opposition is above ground, and it uses democratic institutions, beginning with elections, to contest seriously, vigorously, for power. Elections are often hotly contested. Incumbents really have to sweat it out. The incumbent president does not sleep well the night before the election. And sometimes the incumbents even lose, like the Sandinistas did in 1990, like the PRI did in 2000 in Mexico. But what distinguishes competitive authoritarianism from democracy is that this competition is not fair. Elections are often marred by a certain amount of manipulation, sometimes fraud. Journalists and opposition activists are harassed, threatened, occasionally arrested or exiled, once in a while even killed. And crucially, the political playing field is highly uneven, it's skewed. Incumbents massively abuse state resources. They raid the public treasury. They deploy armies of public employees for election campaigns. And they politicize state institutions like the courts, the police, the tax authorities, and they use those institutions as weapons against the opposition. So soldiers and police work for the governing party. Intelligence agencies spy on the opposition. This sounds like a lot like the United States. Tax authorities, I'll get back to that. Tax authorities investigate and punish independent media owners and businesses that finance the opposition. And the courts are used to convict independent newspaper editors of libel. The result is vast inequality in access to resources and in access to the media. So this is not ordinary run-of-the-mill incumbent advantage, which we see to some degree in every democracy. It's an advantage that is so one-sided and so excessive that it seriously undermines the opposition's ability to compete, so much so that you cannot legitimately call the regime a democracy. Now, competitive authoritarianism, what I've just described, is very much a post-Cold War phenomenon. During the Cold War, most non-democratic regimes were good old-fashioned dictatorships. They were single-party regimes or military dictatorships, like Pinochet in Chile. But starting in the early 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the pretty extraordinary military, economic, ideological domination of the West in the 1990s, Europe and the United States, and unprecedented Western democracy promotion raised the cost of dictatorship in much of the world, in much of the developing world, and created pretty strong incentives to adopt at least the constitutional architecture of democracy, at the very minimum, multi-party elections. And as a result, military dictatorship and single-party rule disappeared across much of the world, disappeared across most of Africa and really all of Latin America outside of Cuba. So unless you were China, or unless you were a major oil producer, the cost of outright dictatorship was really very high after 1990. But there were limits to this international democratizing pressure. The international community insisted on multi-party elections, but beyond that, the level of external pressure, the level of external scrutiny was pretty low. So autocrats over time learned they could still get away with a fair amount of abuse. They couldn't cancel elections, they couldn't ban the opposition like in the good old days, but they could still bully or buy off the media. They could still pack the courts, pack the electoral authorities. They could still manipulate state institutions like the courts, like the tax authorities, to harass their rivals, their opponents. In other words, the international standard was raised to the level of multi-party elections. Everybody had to have elections. But the international standard was not raised to the level of full democracy. And that meant that unless there was a strong domestic push for democracy, what emerged in the 1990s was very often competitive authoritarianism. The numbers are really striking. When Gorbachev took power in the Soviet Union in 1985, there were 7 or 8 competitive authoritarian regimes in the world, depending on how you want to score the Philippines, which I can't decide on. By the mid-1990s, one decade later, there were at least 3 dozen competitive authoritarian regimes. Russia, Ukraine, Armenia, Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Croatia, Peru, Mexico, Malaysia, Taiwan, Kenya, Senegal, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe. I could go on, but that's pretty boring. Now, competitive authoritarian regimes did not fare very well in the Americas in the early 1990s. In fact, all 6 of the competitive authoritarian regimes that existed in the Americas in the early 1990s had collapsed by 2004. This is Nicaragua, Guyana, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Peru, and Haiti. All of them collapsed by the year 2004. And Lucan and I, in our book on competitive authoritarianism, attribute this outcome to the region's extensive ties to the West, to what we call linkage. In the post-Cold War era, after 1989, 1990, linkage, ties to the West, raised the cost of authoritarian abuse, both by making abuse more salient into the international community and by increasing the number of political, economic, technocratic actors who had a stake in preserving good ties to the West. So where linkage is extensive, as it is in much of Latin America, as it is in much of Central Europe, the cost of fraud, the cost of repression is higher, which increases the likelihood that autocrats will choose to cede power rather than crack down in the face of serious opposition challenges. And that is what happened to varying degrees in Mexico, in Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Guyana. But of course, history did not end in 2004, although we had to publish our book. Competitive authoritarianism reemerged over the last 12, 13 years in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua. So what explains this authoritarian resurgence, particularly in the Andean region? That's what I want to focus on mostly today. Some observers, at least in the United States, sort of pinned the blame on the left turn. They argued that the authoritarian turn was a product of left-wing government. And one variant of this approach points to the role of the Chavez government in diffusing this Bolivarian model across the region, transforming it into kind of an authoritarian manual or playbook or blueprint. Kurt Weiland, a political scientist at the University of Texas, makes a different argument. He argues that the radical programmatic goals advanced by left-wing governments created incentives to concentrate power. You can't build 21st century socialism or end 500 years of colonial domination when the opposition controls the Supreme Court and the Congress. You're forced to sort of concentrate power. I'm not convinced that leftist ideology is what explains this. Alberto Fujimori was not a leftist, and he concentrated and abused power in exactly the same way as Correa and Chavez. And of course, left governments elsewhere in Latin America, from Paraguay to El Salvador to Argentina to Brazil did not move in an authoritarian direction. So I don't think it was the left that was driving this. Another explanation that I don't agree with focuses on the commodities boom, on the rise in the prices of minerals, particularly the price of minerals. So my friend and colleague Sebastian Masuka argues that commodity rents, that high prices of commodities, allowed governments, certain governments anyway, to use massive social spending to build robust majority coalitions among the poor, to basically buy off the poor with social spending, particularly buy off the informal sector, the urban informal poor. And these big popular majorities among the poor, bought off with vast social spending, would allow governments to use plebiscitary strategies to concentrate power and govern in an increasingly despotic manner. So you've got all this money coming in, you spend it on the poor, then you hold a plebiscite saying, I want to stay in power, I want to end term limits and get reelected forever, and the poor vote for you. That's the Mazuka argument. There's no question that mineral rents can facilitate authoritarian power grabs. But mineral booms, I think, are neither necessary nor sufficient to explain competitive authoritarianism. Peru slid into competitive authoritarianism in the 1990s, where commodity prices were low. And Peru remained democratic when mineral prices skyrocketed in the 2000s. So Peru doesn't fit this argument at all. Chavez began his authoritarian turn before the rise in oil prices. And of course, Chile remained solidly democratic throughout the mineral boom. So I don't think mineral prices or commodity prices explain this outcome either. James Loxton and I argue that what's really critical about Sebastian Masuka's rentier populism is not the mineral rent so much as the populism. It is populism, both of the left and of the right, that pushes fragile democracies into competitive authoritarianism. Everyone's got a different definition of populism. Let me tell you mine. Mine is the top-down mobilization of lower-class constituencies, usually by a personalistic outsider, against the entire political and economic elite. It's the top-down mobilization of the poor, usually by a personalistic outsider, against the entire elite. So populists mobilize the poor against the political establishment and against its institutions, attacking those things, attacking the elite and elite institutions as corrupt, oligarchic, and representative, and basically promising to sweep them away. Operationally, full-scale populists share three characteristics. First of all, they are political outsiders. They emerge from outside of the existing party system. Secondly, they establish personalistic linkages to voters. They bypass political parties. They bypass representative institutions. They work through direct appeals. And third, they make explicitly anti-system appeals. So Perón back in the 40s, Chavez, Fujimori, Correa, Lucio Gutierrez in Ecuador clearly fit this category. Now, I argue that an anti-system appeal is an essential defining feature of populism. You cannot have populism without an anti-system appeal. But some cases meet two of the three criteria. And Loxton and I characterize these as sort of partial subtypes of populism. So, following Robert Barr, career politicians, established politicians who break away from established parties and make personalistic, anti-establishment appeals could be called maverick populists. This is Rafael Caldera in Venezuela, Fernando Collor de Mello in Brazil. That's a type of populism that's slightly different. And outsiders who emerge from below as part of radical social movements but make anti-system appeals might be described as movement populists. And this is Evo Morales. So I would say Morales is a variant of populism, not a full-scale case. Now, populism is not the root cause of democratic failure in the Andes. Countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela possess a range of structural factors that make them vulnerable to democratic breakdown. They have weak states, they have weak political parties, they suffer from extreme social inequality, and they have suffered over the last 25, 30 years from descent into pretty severe economic crises. They have a record of poor economic performance. All of those things make democratic breakdown, make these countries vulnerable to democratic breakdown. But populism is the catalyst. Populism is what helps to explain why, when, and exactly how some fragile democracies slide or decay into competitive authoritarianism while others don't. So they're all vulnerable to competitive authoritarianism, but if you want to know why some do and some don't, populism is the sort of short-term catalyst. Why is that? I argue that, or Jamie Loxton and I argue, that the election of a populist president, the successful rise of a populist, increases the likelihood of a slide into competitive authoritarianism for several reasons. First of all, populists, again, by definition, are political outsiders. And outsiders very often lack a strong commitment to the institutions of liberal democracy. Whatever you may think, and probably most people at most talks I give don't think very highly, whatever you may think of established career professional politicians, most of them are at least minimally committed to working through democratic institutions. They have spent their entire career working through democratic institutions. They're pretty experienced with the nuts and bolts, I don't know how that translates into Swedish, of democratic politics, things like negotiation, things like coalition building. They know how to achieve their goals through representative institutions. They know how to get legislation through parliament. They know how to work the courts. They know how to work the media. And they have a stake in preserving those institutions because it's their livelihood. It's what they do. It's the only career they've ever had. With outsiders, it's more of a crapshoot. Outsiders are political amateurs. That means they have very little experience working through democratic institutions. Very often, they lack the skills to deal effectively with opposition, to build and sustain political coalitions, to succeed in the give and take of legislative politics. And many of them, not only do they lack the skills to do these things, they lack the patience for it as well. According to a former aide of former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori, and I quote, couldn't stand the idea of inviting the President of the Senate to lunch in the presidential palace every time he wanted to pass a law. Just didn't like that stuff. Now, some outsiders turn out to be Democrats. Alejandro Toledo was a Democrat. Fernando Lugo in Paraguay was a Democrat. But many of the outsiders elected in Latin America over the last 30 or 40 years have not been Democrats. Fujimori, Chavez, Jorge Serrano in Guatemala, Lucio Gutierrez, and Rafael Correa in Ecuador. In fact, every single president who has closed down the Congress in Latin America over the last 30 years has been an outsider. Fujimori, Serrano, Chavez, Correa. So that's one factor. Even more important than that, though, is how populists are elected. Populists campaign for president on a pledge to do away with the old system. They promised voters to bury what they depict as a corrupt, unrepresentative oligarchy. Sweeping away the entire political elite and its institutions is a pretty radical mandate. But that's what these guys are elected to do. They campaign on that, and they are elected to bury the old elite and the old system. The problem, though, in these cases, is that the old system is usually a democracy, and the corrupt, unrepresentative institutions that populists promise to sweep away are things like legislatures, political parties, the Supreme Court. And in fact, when populists win the presidency, they often find that the old elite that they campaigned against still controls those other institutions. The traditional parties often still have a majority in Congress. The appointees of the traditional parties still control the Supreme Court or the electoral authorities. For a political outsider, particularly one who is elected on a pledge to do away with the old system, that creates an incentive to assault these institutions, to close down Congress, to pack the courts, to rewrite the Constitution. If you were elected on a platform of sweeping away the old elite, then to sit down and negotiate with that elite, to build coalitions, to make policy with that elite, to govern with that elite, like Lula did in Brazil, that is a betrayal of your electoral mandate. And betraying a populist mandate can be politically very costly, as Lucio Gutierrez learned in Ecuador. So populist presidents have an incentive a strong political incentive to assault democratic institutions. That is a recipe for crisis. It's a recipe for a showdown, a conflict between a popular president who has just gotten elected promising to sweep away those corrupt and unrepresentative institutions, on the one hand, and a political elite that now views those institutions as a last bastion of defense. Now, sometimes the outsider presidents lose that battle, that showdown. That happened to Jorge Serrano in Guatemala, 1993. The opposition won. It happened to Lucio Gutierrez in Ecuador in 2005. But usually, the populist president wins for a couple of reasons. First of all, when a newly elected populist president takes on the old traditional political elite, public opinion tends to overwhelmingly favor the president. We saw this in Fujimori's Peru. We saw it in Venezuela under Chavez. We saw it in Ecuador under Correa. In each of those cases, Peru, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia too, when the president began his assault on the old regime, he enjoyed 70 or 80% public support. People were clearly with the president. I'll come back to that. Secondly, the opposition's lack of public support is complemented, is reinforced, is exacerbated by organizational weakness. In the aftermath of a populist victory, when a political amateur, a political nobody, like Alberto Fujimori, wins the presidency, the opposition is almost always, invariably, disorganized and weak, fragmented. Populists win elections when established parties are in crisis. And when a populist wins, the so-called traditional parties tend to be really badly discredited. Their support bases evaporate, and politicians abandon them in droves. Nobody, no ambitious politician, wants to be associated with the traditional parties that have just been defeated by a political outsider. So the established parties fall apart. And as a result, opposition forces, the new opposition, tends to be fragmented and disorganized, which makes it really hard for them to mobilize against presidential abuse. We saw this in Peru after Fujimori. We saw it in Venezuela. We saw it in Ecuador. Now, when a populist president prevails, when he wins in this showdown or conflict with the opposition, the result is almost always a tilted playing field. With 70 or 80% public support, with a fragmented and discredited opposition, and with weak institutional constraints, because remember, these are weak democracies to begin with, presidents can concentrate a lot of power. They can close Congress and elect a new one with a pro-government majority. They can pack the courts. They can pack the electoral authorities. They can pack other state institutions. They can rewrite electoral laws to weaken opposition parties. And in many cases, they can impose a new constitution that strengthens the executive vis-a-vis other branches of government. That is a recipe for competitive authoritarianism. Jamie and I examined all 14 presidents elected in Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, and Bolivia between 1990 and 2010. We later added the Humala government in Peru. So of these 14, 4 of them were full-blown populists. Fujimori, Chavez, Gutierrez, Correa. One of them was a movement populist, Evo Morales. 2 were maverick populists, Caldera and Bucaram, Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador. The other 7 were of various types, but they were non-populists. So 7 were populists and 4 were non-populists. All 4 cases of full-blown populism, again, Fujimori, Chavez, Gutierrez, and Correa, resulted in competitive authoritarianism, 4 out of 4. The one case of movement populism, Morales, also resulted in competitive authoritarianism, albeit in a somewhat milder form. Interestingly, our 2 cases of maverick populists, traditional politicians who defected and ran as populists, this is Caldera and Bucaram, did not lead to competitive authoritarianism. So outsider status seems to matter somewhat. And finally, of our 7 non-populist presidents, not a single one resulted in competitive authoritarianism. The non-populists were not angels. They were not all liberal Democrats by any stretch of the imagination. In Bolivia, for example, both the Banzer and Sanchez de Lozada governments engaged in pretty violent repression. So these were not full-scale Democrats. But they produced, and in fact you could argue that both Bolivia and Ecuador were hybrid regimes even before Correa and Morales. But there were different kinds of hybrid regimes. There were what some people call illiberal democracies. Competitive authoritarianism, in which the playing field is tilted in favor of the incumbent, almost always emerges out of populism. Let me briefly mention two additional cases for those who are interested. Honduras and Peru. Honduras is a case of abortive competitive authoritarianism under Manuel Zelaya. Zelaya tried to borrow a page from the Bolivarian handbook, but basically failed and was overthrown in a military coup. He failed because the Bolivarian playbook by itself is not enough. You need the conditions that are created by populism. And Zelaya pretended to be a populist, but he was not elected. He did not come to power via a populist appeal. He was a mainstream candidate of the Liberal Party. He tried to launch a populist project later after assuming the presidency, but the balance of power, the kind of power asymmetry that I described in the populist cases, was absent in Honduras. Zelaya lacked a populist mandate. He had not been elected to destroy the old political elite. And the political establishment, including the two traditional parties, the National Party, the Liberal Party, remained very strong. They were not weakened and discredited as they were in the populist cases. So the opposition parties were able to block him fairly easily. Unfortunately, they did it with a coup that also derailed Honduran democracy. What about Peru under Ollanta Humala? Humala was clearly a populist in 2006 when he basically followed the Chavista model and ran as an anti-system, pretty radical anti-system outsider. Had Humala won the 2006 election, we might well have seen an outcome similar to Ecuador, to Gutierrez and Correa. Probably more Gutierrez than Correa, but you probably would have seen a crisis and movement in a competitive authoritarian direction. But Humala lost the 2006 election. And when he ran again in 2011, he totally abandoned his populist appeal. Humala won, never attacked the establishment during the 2011 campaign. In fact, he aligned himself with a good chunk of the establishment during his second round campaign. Humala won in 2011 because he was backed by liberals like Alejandro Toledo and Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa, a known libertarian. He did not win in 2011 because of a populist or anti-system appeal. So Ollanta Humala, when he won the presidency in 2011, never won a mandate to refound the republic. And during his 5-year presidency, 2011 to 16, he never tried to concentrate power. He never tried to rewrite the constitutional rules of the game. That's not what he was elected to do. He did not possess a balance of power that favored that. Now, populism is a proximate cause of competitive authoritarianism. It is much more of a catalyst than an underlying cause. So that raises the question of where successful populism comes from. And specifically, at least to me, how you get a constituency for populism. Populists, at least contemporary Latin American populists, rely very heavily on plebiscitary appeals. In order to carry out a Bolivarian project, in order to do what Chavez and Correa did, you have to be able to demonstrate overwhelming popular support for an assault on the status quo. In other words, you need 70 or 80% support to close Congress, to reorganize the judiciary, to rewrite the Constitution. That 70 or 80% support does several things. First of all, it buys international legitimacy. It's hard for anybody to question a president who wins a referendum with 78% of the vote. It demoralizes the opposition. The opposition often, gives up when you're winning plebiscites with 75% of the vote. And it gives the president, oftentimes, the legislative supermajority, 2/3 of Congress, that's necessary to unilaterally rewrite the constitutional rules of the game. Now, it's not every day that any president, any government, gets 70 or 80% support. It's not every day that 70 or 80% of the electorate is willing to back an assault on representative democratic institutions. So we have to understand better where that 70% comes from. How a country gets to the place where 70% of the population is willing to support taking a wrecking ball to existing representative institutions. And I want to suggest that that 70% is rooted in three structural factors. One of them, underlying one, is social inequality, which remains widespread everywhere in Latin America. Now, that's critical. But democracy can coexist with a fair amount of inequality. Inequality creates problems for democracy when it pervades the political arena, when it translates into severe political inequality. And here the key is the political elite. For democracy to work well, the political elite needs to be broadly representative of society. And that's often not been the case in Latin America. Populists mobilize the poor around the idea that the political elite, the whole political elite, does not represent them, that it excludes them. Historically, the key to building a minimally representative political elite has been popular parties, has been mass political parties. Parties like Acción Democrática in Venezuela, like Peronism in Argentina, like the Workers' Party in Brazil, the Frente Amplio in Uruguay. Where the bulk of the popular sector, where a good chunk of the low-income electorate identifies with an established mass political party, like in Uruguay, like in Argentina, like until recently, at least, in Brazil and Chile. Outsiders don't win. Populist outsiders do not win. The problem is that mass parties, in fact, all political parties, have been weakening across Latin America, especially in the Andes. And as a result, outsider politics has become a near constant of political life in the Andes. You combine outsider politics, the collapse of political parties, with extreme social inequality, and you have a very high probability of populism. But it is not just inequality and weak parties that generates that 70%. It is also, and this is I think the most important factor, state weakness. By state weakness, I mean the inability of state institutions to carry out certain basic tasks: collecting taxes, building roads and schools, implementing social programs, providing public security, upholding the rule of law. When states are ineffective, as they are in much of the Andes, it is almost impossible for governments to govern well, no matter how honest they are, no matter how well trained they are, no matter how well intentioned they are. Where states can't tax, where they can't get bureaucrats to carry out basic tasks that they're instructed to carry out, when they cannot enforce the rule of law that's written in the Constitution, even the best governments are not going to be able to deliver the goods. They won't be able to pave roads, to provide security, to protect consumers, to keep schools and hospitals supplied. And when governments consistently fail to deliver the goods, new democracies eventually get into trouble. So rather than being protected by the state, rather than being served by the state, citizens start to feel abandoned by the state, even mistreated by the state. And that is a source of major public disaffection. But that disaffection is not distributed equally across society. State weakness always hits the poor hardest. The rich can live with an ineffective state. They just have private schools, they have private hospitals, they can protect themselves with private security guards and private lawyers, and when they really must deal with state bureaucrats, they can always pay bribes. The poor have none of those options available. They are stuck with lousy public schools and lousy public hospitals, and they have no choice but to rely on inept, indifferent, and often corrupt public bureaucrats. They live in a world, in addition, in which the police and the courts and other agencies of the state always seem to be working for somebody else, somebody with more money. This is crucial. If the state cannot ensure that its citizens in the highlands, in the jungle, in the shanty towns, enjoy even the minimum rights and protections that are guaranteed to them by law, then citizens are going to begin to feel like they're being unfairly treated by the state. And when that perception of unfairness persists over time, from one government to the next government to a third government, citizens start to conclude, reasonably enough, that all politicians are the same, that all the parties are the same, that all politicians are corrupt, that no one in the political class represents them. It's those citizens who are most likely to vote for political outsiders who promise to throw everybody out. We saw that in Peru in 1990, we saw it in Venezuela in 1998, we saw it in Bolivia and Ecuador in the 2000s. Ultimately, it is state weakness that generates the kind of public discontent, the kind of public distrust, the kind of raw public anger that creates that 70% constituency for populism. How am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay. I want to close by talking about the most recent case of populism in the Americas, the United States. Donald Trump is clearly a populist. He was a political outsider who mobilized the masses with an anti-establishment appeal. And in many ways, Trump's behavior in office resembles that of Fujimori, Correa, and other Latin American populists. But of course, U.S. democracy is pretty different from those in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Peru. It's got a much stronger institutional foundation. The U.S. has the oldest, the most successful constitution in the world. It has relatively strong political parties. It's got an independent judiciary. It has a pretty well-established rule of law. So what that means is that Trump can't just call out the tanks and close Congress like Fujimori did in Peru. He can't just rewrite the Constitution via referendum like Hugo Chavez did. That's a pretty important difference. But I want to suggest that we shouldn't take the effectiveness of U.S. institutions for granted. Constitutional checks and balances are not self-enacting. They don't work automatically. They only work well when they're reinforced by strong democratic norms or informal rules. In our book, How Democracies Die, Daniel Zivlat and I focus on two of these norms in particular, two unwritten norms that have long sustained U.S. democracy. One of them is what we call mutual toleration. It's the norm, it's a very basic norm, of accepting the legitimacy of our opponents, not treating them as dangerous enemies. It means that no matter how much we may disagree with the other party, no matter how much we may dislike the politicians of the other party, we recognize, both privately and publicly, that they are loyal citizens who love the country and are not conspiring against it. They're not subversives, they're not enemies. Very important. The other norm is what we call forbearance, or using one's institutional prerogatives with restraint. Let me do that. The opposite of forbearance, just to explain it a little bit more, is what my colleague at the Harvard Law School, Mark Tushnet, calls constitutional hardball, or deploying the letter of the law in ways that violate the spirit of the law. We see constitutional hardball all the time in Latin America. The impeachments of President Lugo in Paraguay, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the removal of, for mental incapacity of President Abdallah Bucaram in Ecuador, Argentine court packing under Perón, under Menem, under Kirchner, the use of a loyalist Supreme Court to invalidate everything passed by the opposition Congress in Maduro's Venezuela. All those are cases of using the letter of the law in ways that subvert the spirit of the law. If politicians use their institutional prerogatives to the hilt in this way, exploiting the letter of the law for maximum partisan gain, any system of checks and balances, no matter how well designed, will become vulnerable to deadlock, to dysfunction, and even to authoritarianism. Arguably, at least we argue in our book, that it's not the brilliant design of the U.S. Constitution that prevents Paraguayan-style impeachment or that prevents Argentine-style court packing. It is underlying norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. American democracy has not always had strong norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Did not have them in the early years of the Republic. This is something I learned for the first time researching this book. The 1790s, the United States looked like Ecuador. Did not have them for quite a while in the middle part of the 19th century. But beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans began to accept one another as legitimate rivals and largely refrained from destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments. There were no successful court packings. Checks and balances basically worked. But again, they worked not because, or not entirely because of what was written in the Constitution. They worked because they were reinforced by strong democratic norms. In our book, Ziblatt and I argue that those norms of mutual toleration and forbearance are eroding in the United States. They've been eroding for the last quarter century, mainly as a result of intensifying partisan polarization. Donald Trump did not create that problem. He's more of a symptom than a cause. But he is likely to exacerbate that problem. Populists are serial norm violators. If there's one thing populists do, it's violate norms. They almost always, for example, treat their political rivals as enemies and traitors. They label them as criminals, as fascists, as subversives, as enemies of the people. That undermines mutual toleration. It did in Venezuela, it did in Peru, it's doing it in the United States. Populists are also masters of constitutional hardball. When you depict your opponents as treasonous enemies of the people, there is very little reason, very little justification for restraint or for forbearance. If the opposition are traitors, if the opposition are enemies of the people, if the opposition are enemies, you use the power conferred upon you by your electoral majority to the fullest possible extent. You concentrate power. You pack the courts and other state institutions, and you wield them against that conspiring enemy elite. And you use your legislative majorities to rewrite the political rules of the game so that enemy elite can never return to power. Finally, populists are polarizing, which further reinforces norm erosion. As my Yale colleague Milan Svolik has shown, polarization, intense polarization, increases toleration for authoritarian abuse, as long as that abuse targets the other side. And public opinion polls show that that is happening, that toleration for authoritarian abuse is growing among Republican voters today. An increasing number of Republican voters, after hearing Donald Trump attack the media for more than a year now, calling the media, accusing the media of conspiring to bring down his government, a growing number of Republican voters now are willing to tolerate laws that allow the government to punish media that publish inaccurate information. Polarization can affect democracy in another way as well. Polarization can encourage the opposition to respond with norm-violating behavior. Almost done. So Democrats, the opposition Democratic Party, is now being called upon to learn how to fight like Republicans, to use tools like obstruction and maybe even impeachment against Donald Trump, to engage in constitutional hardball. And they, in fact, are starting to do just that. But if Democrats follow suit, if Democrats respond to Trump's norm erosion with constitutional hardball, it will only accelerate the process of norm erosion the United States is already suffering. So even if Trump does not break through the guardrails of our democracy, and he probably will not, he is very likely to weaken our democratic norms even further, expanding the zone of acceptable behavior in ways that leave the United States democracy more vulnerable. I think the one thing, and I will end with this, that helps to protect American democracy is the ethno-nationalist character of Trump's populism, of his populist coalition. Trump's popular support base, compared to the populists that we discussed in Latin America, is relatively narrow. It's much more narrow than those of Chavez, Fujimori, Correa, Morales. And that is mostly rooted in the ethno-nationalist character of North American populism. U.S. populism is very, very different from Latin American populism. It's much more narrowly based because it appeals almost exclusively to less educated whites. So it unlike Chavez's populism, it excludes a big chunk of the people, basically non-whites. That leaves Trump unable to mobilize big majorities. So whereas a populist appeal can win 70, even 80% support in Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, U.S. populism, because of its ethno-nationalist character, cannot appeal to a majority of Americans. It turns off the nearly 40% of the American citizenry that is non-white. but it also turns off a substantial number of urban, secular, educated whites. So the size of the non-white and white liberal electorates makes it impossible, mathematically impossible, for Trump to build the kind of majority coalition that we saw, say, in Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. As we saw, electoral supermajorities, that 70 or 80% support, is critical to the success of populist authoritarianism. That's what provides the kind of legislative dominance or plebiscitary appeals that allows governments to change the rules of the game that really tilt the playing field against the opposition. Ethno-nationalist appeals, at least in the United States, cannot build that kind of majority, at least not in the absence of a major war or security crisis. The one thing that keeps me awake at night about American politics is the possibility of a September 11th style attack under the Trump presidency. That is the one thing that could create 78 or 80% support under Trump. Without that kind of a crisis, it's impossible. He'll be stuck at 45% forever. So in short, populism in the United States is in some ways nastier than Latin American populism. It's more exclusionary and is infused with a heavy dose of racism. But precisely because of that exclusionary character, Trumpista populism lacks the sort of majoritarian basis of its Latin American counterpart. And that may mean that it's less damaging ultimately to U.S. institutions. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Steve. And we give the word to Maria Therese.
So, thank you very much for this very interesting talk to discuss the consequences of populism in this time when we have witnessing populists rising all over the world, and also in the polls for the Swedish election for September is a very interesting topic. And first, I would like to go back to ask you a question related to national resources that you just mentioned briefly. I have myself a background in studying the extractive governance in Latin America. In that literature, it's generally argued that in the context of weak institutions, political elites use the revenues from national resources for rent-seeking purposes. And so I wonder, because in all of the cases that you are studying, like Peru, Venezuela, Bolivia and Ecuador, they are really countries with large amount of national resources and revenues. And even in the case like Chavez that you mentioned, that he was elected in 1999 before the resource boom in 2002, there was still some revenues from national resources at that time as well. And of course, what you are looking at, you are talking about the permissive conditions that enable populist presidents to come to power, and that's in weak parties and weak institutions. But I wonder also if it wouldn't be interesting to look also at the sources of power that enable populist presidents to endure over time, and how you see the role of the revenues from the national resources in that regard. Because in the case, for example, like in the case of, because I mean, like, in order to maintain legitimacy, you need some kind of redistributing mechanism to maintain your legitimacy if you are not just basing your power on coercive mechanism. Like in the case of Fujimori, he could rely on comprehensive privatizations for investing in rural areas. And as far as I understand, in the case of, like, nowadays in Bolivia and Venezuela and Ecuador, revenues are playing an important role in sustaining the support for the regime. So my question is how you view the link between sustained populism and how it endures over time, and democracy and national resources in these cases that you are looking at, but also perhaps more in general.
So revenues obviously matter. Governments that are bankrupt, governments without revenue are much, much quicker to fall. Revenue can come in various ways. It can come from high growth, it can come from privatization, it can come from minerals. But no question, all things equal, I don't think revenue causes populism. I don't think it causes the slide into competitive authoritarianism. But it does do what you just said. It helps governments maintain, I don't know about legitimacy, but public support for sure, over time. So, the government of Evo Morales has now lasted 13 years. The Chavista government in Venezuela has endured now for 2 decades. The Correa remained in power for more than a decade. Those kind of lifespans would be much less likely with low commodity prices. So there's no question that it helps them stabilize and extend their rule. But I don't think it's a fundamental either cause of populism or the cause of the slide into populism. But there's no question that revenue helps.
Okay. So my next question relates to whether populism always have negative impacts on democracy. And of course, if you depart from a liberal democratic perspectives, and as absurd in your cases, that seems definitely to be the case. But if you have a more broader perspective on democracy, our colleague, for example, Benjamin Moffitt, who has written a book on the global rise on populism, he discusses how you can see this in different ways, the impacts of populism on democracy. And one of the authors he quotes is Laclau, who has stated that radical democracy is always populist. Without populism, we have no people, and without the people, we have no democracy. So I wonder, when you...
Without populism, we have no people?
Without... Yeah, actually.
I would contest that.
So, but what I would like to ask you more in general, and more particularly in the cases that you are looking at, can you see that there are some positive implications of populism, like in the case of, for example, Morales, in some, at least in the early years, he was often described more in terms of a hero for some people. So can you see that there are some positive aspects as well of populism in these countries in terms of participatory rights, redistribution and social rights and so on?
Sure. Great question. So I'm not trying to paint a black and white world in which liberal democracy is good, everything else is bad. I'm not trying to, and populists are always, this is the first thing I teach my undergraduates, populists are often polarized, and they tend to be viewed in black and white terms. Either if you're either with Chavez or you're against him. You're with Morales or against him. Populists are always gray. They're always ambiguous and double-edged in terms in their consequences. I am not saying that populists bring unambiguously negative consequences. I'm trying to focus on a very concrete, narrow outcome, and that is liberal democracy. I believe that at least in a context of weak democracies, that populism has negative consequences for liberal democracy. Now, in cases of really established liberal democracies that are not as vulnerable to breakdown, populism may have a different effect. Now, populism has numerous positive effects. Populism is almost invariably inclusionary. Almost invariably inclusionary. Populism brings to power, successful populist governments offer channels of access to power and often bring into power representatives of groups that have either been either excluded physically from positions of power, or symbolically from positions of power, or marginalized, or excluded or marginalized from power. That is inclusion is something that I view as a positive thing. That's not the same thing as liberal democracy. When we talk about in the modern world, I mean, Laclau can write what he wants, except that he's dead. You guys don't laugh at my jokes. But modern democracy is liberal democracy. And that's not the same thing as inclusion. It's not the same thing as redistribution. It's not the same thing as popular mobilization. It's not the same thing as participation. So populists may generate redistribution. They may bring greater inclusion. They may or may not bring greater participation. what they don't do is strengthen liberal democracies. So if you want to advance another definition of democracy and say populism is good for that, that's fine. But take a standard comparative politics definition of liberal democracy, and I think you cannot sustain an argument that populism even has mixed effects. It has negative effects. That's not to say that it doesn't have positive effects for other things. I'm not one of those people who thinks that all good things go together and all bad things go together. Populists bring inclusion, they don't bring liberal democracy.
Okay, so just one last question. The populists that you study in these cases, they are very different in terms of the ideology and their links to societal actors, like in the case of Morales, who has a movement behind him. So I wonder if can you really compare those different? Aren't they too different? Doesn't ideology and links to societal actors affect the outcomes in very important ways, or do you think that?
It may. I mean, Morales is a different kind of populist. There are not many cases like that. I think it's sort of a hybrid because Morales is also a very personalistic figure. I mean, the importance of Morales to the movement is seen in the fact that the movement has decided they can't live without him, which is why they have bent over backwards and done gymnastics to reform the Constitution. Pretty illegal gymnastics to reform the Constitution to make sure that he is once again the presidential candidate of the month. So this is not entirely a leaderless grassroots movement from below, although it does have a social movement component that you don't see in Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela. So that does make it a different form of populism. We call it movement populism. Is it impossible to compare? I think you have to ask the question. And I think that there are some ways in which it's different. There's some ways in which Morales has been held more accountable than some of the entirely personalistic presidents. But there are other areas where really the political dynamics have been surprisingly similar to the other populists. So I don't think you can decide in advance whether it's comparable or not. I think you have to do the comparison and see.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know if I have more time, but just one quick question, more detailed question. Like, so what happened if a populist ran for office another time? I was playing with thought, like, for example, if Alberto Fujimori, the father, if he would run for office now, would he have been learned how to play the game and accept the rules more?
We do have a case in that, which is Peron in 1973.
Yeah, okay.
Right? An old populist comes back after 20 years and wins. And he didn't govern in the same way. Although the regime sort of fell into authoritarianism for a bunch of reasons, it wasn't the same dynamic as 1946. Okay. I think Alberto looks like, I was a little worried about him, but it looks like he's too old to make another play for the presidency. But yeah, an experience. Eventually, a populist president really ceases to be populist, right? By the end, Hugo Chavez was the establishment in Venezuela. And that was certainly true of Fujimori already by the late 1990s. It really was not populist. So the populists do change. Do they become more democratic? Not always, not necessarily.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maria Teresa. Now we open the floor for questions, and we had Fredrik there first.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It raises, it answers several questions and it raises several others. But let me continue just on this last point. What happens if a populist comes back? There is actually a case of this, I would argue, and one which might complicate the relationship between populism and competitive authoritarianism, and that is Nicaragua. Of course, Daniel Ortega coming to power after the Sandinista revolution represented a lot of the populist traits, except that it came on a moment. But as he today comes to establish competitive authoritarian regime, it's very difficult to see him as populist. At least according to what you have said here. I mean, he's not an outsider. He's made deal with the entire political spectrum. It's, it's obviously on the basis of the party. And that makes me think there are a number of cases here of competitive authoritarianism in Latin America that has happened without populism.
Yes,
you mentioned before Mexico, Paraguay, in the 90s on the Colorados. You mentioned Honduras under Zelaya, but you didn't mention Honduras under Hernandez, who has now managed to do exactly what Zelaya wanted to do. So obviously there are competitive authoritarianism emerging. Well, those Mexico, Paraguay in earlier epoch, Nicaragua, Honduras now, without necessarily that populist character.
Yeah.
But that makes me think about aspect, let's say, dynamic aspect here that Maria Therese touched upon as well. If we look beyond Latin America, we will see certain leaders that didn't come to power as populists, but who became populist as they developed towards competitive authoritarianism. Were we to look back to 1999, happier time, we would have found that Vladimir Putin was recently brought in as prime minister, obviously not a political outsider at that time, and followed the president, Yeltsin, in that. We would have found Erdogan, the leader of supposed Turkish Christian democracy, or Muslim democracy, but at least a much more moderate party, whereas in Viktor Orban as a leader of Fidesz, that was then a democratic party. All of those leaders became populist more or less at the same time as it became competitive authoritarianism, or developed towards competitive authoritarianism, which to me begs the question, what came first here? Could it be that for certain leaders, they developed this, the populism as a rationale, or let's say ex post rationale for moving towards competitive authoritarianism? That would fit Putin, for instance. Putin obviously didn't run in the year 2000 as a radical outsider. He had just been prime minister, and he was very much seen as Yeltsin's pick for prime minister. It was only when he tried to develop and consolidate his power that he started developing the nationalism and invading, well, neighboring countries. It would fit Viktor Orban as well. Viktor Orban had been in Hungarian politics for a long time on the Democratic Party. It would fit Erdogan, well, possibly. And that brings me then to the question that if this dynamic occurs, you can ask what is the cause and the effect here. Is it populism that generates the competitive authoritarianism, or is it the drive to establish competitive authoritarianism that brings out the populists in politicians that previously have not been noted exactly for being nationalists or violent anti-systemic characters here?
So that is a great question. So the first part of the answer is that, as my colleague at Harvard, Ricardo Hausmann, puts it, there are many ways to die.
Yeah.
There are many ways for democracies to break down. Populism is one road, but it's not the only road. And you're very right. The Ortega case is an excellent case. Ortega sometimes gets called a populist. He's not remotely the current version of Ortega.
He's the only insider.
He's a complete insider. And won the presidency as an insider, and has nevertheless moved in a competitive authoritarian direction. So you're right that populism is not the only path to competitive authoritarianism anywhere, even in Latin America. Although I think it's become, in the last quarter century, probably the most widely trodden path. In the cases of, so there simply are other paths to competitive authoritarianism. I think populism is to put in sort of necessary necessary and sufficient terms, it is a sufficient cause, but not a necessary cause for sliding the competitive authoritarianism. These other cases, Putin, somebody has to explain to me how on God's earth Vladimir Putin is a populist. In what capacity is Vladimir Putin a populist? I mean, in my country, we have a tendency to sort of paint everybody we don't like as a populist. Somebody who's sort of maybe statist or nationalist, they're a populist. Or if they spend too much money, they're a populist. Allende is a populist. Lula is a populist. But I don't see where Putin is even remotely populist. He's nationalist. He's authoritarian. He's statist. I don't like him. I don't think he's a populist. He's not anti-elite. He's from the elite. There's no elite for him to bash anymore. So I do not see him as a populist. Erdogan and Orban, Erdogan has populist elements to him, for sure. And the AKP always sort of has. Orban, I think, Orban's an anti-Semite. He's become a thug. He's become a nationalist. Yeah, his anti-Semitic stuff is a little bit populist, but it's hard to be populist from power. And I think we're stretching the concept of populist, as many of my colleagues in the United States do. I think we're stretching the concept of populism to call these guys populists. Although Erdogan, I grant you, there is a real element of populism too. So, yeah, I mean, populism is a strategy. that is employed by politicians of various types. It can be employed by somebody in power. It's more often employed by outsiders seeking into power. I mean, it's a more natural strategy when you're an outsider trying to get in to promise to bury the elite than when you've been in power for 8 or 10 years and you're the elite.
But you called Caldera a populist, didn't you?
Caldera adopted a populist strategy when he ran for president, for sure, in '93, right?
Yeah.
But did actually and was pushed by some of his advisors to kind of move in a competitive authoritarian direction and resisted it, which suggests to me that being an outsider matters a lot. So yeah, I mean, people in power can use populist strategies, but I think I don't think a lot of these guys that we're labeling populist really meet the definition that I've employed as populist. That's the answer.
Okay, Carlos.
I think about the People's Party in USA in 19th century. My question is, may we use the American old populism to understand another populism? May you compare American old populism with classical Latin American populism, Vargas y Brasil, Perón y Argentina, o Cárdenas y México? Or may you compare the old American populism with the Trump's populism?
There's an element. I'm not much of an expert on late 19th, early 20th century American populism. One thing that distinguishes it from Latin American populism is that it was almost entirely rural. It was a rural populism. In general, it was a little bit less personalistic and a little less anti-institutional, less plebiscitarian than contemporary populism. But there are similarities. I mean, there's a clear anti-elite appeal, right? So in that sense, fairly similar. I think Trump is more similar. There are other cases of American populism, not the People's Party, but Huey Long, George Wallace in particular. Those two cases are the best cases of 20th century American populists who are more similar to Trump. The populism that eventually actually merged with the Democratic Party, I think is more of a hybrid. I think it is populism, but it's a little bit different as well.
Okay, Torsten?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation that raises a lot of thoughts. Now, we've been talking very much about populism and what it actually means, etc. I would like to put a question that is linked to populism and leftist populism, but goes a bit outside this as well, because you've been describing several expressions of leftist populism in Latin America, stated that this was very much a reaction against neoliberal economic policies, combined with high inequality, that sort of created the possibilities for the rise of different leftist populist movements and precedents. Now, with the end of the commodity boom, the possibilities seems to have changed quite substantially, and we are seeing other political perspectives now. If you would like to, if you should look into the future and what is possible, when it comes to political development in Latin America in the future, do you see possibilities for a new leftist populist sort of wave if we don't see a boom, a future booming when it comes to commodity prices? And do you see any possibilities of another kind of left, of a more social democratic left in Latin America in the future?
Great question. So one minor correction. I would be careful not to conflate leftism and populism. I think they're entirely different things. I think you have populism and non-populism on one axis and left and right on another. There are left-wing populists, Hugo Chavez, There are left-wing non-populists, Lula, or Allende. There are right-wing populists, Fujimori. There are right-wing non-populists, Piñera in Chile. The two, I don't think should be conflated. They clustered together in 3 or 4 cases, really 3 cases, in the Andes in the mid-2000s. So certainly in my country, the two are conflated, but I don't think they should be conflated. I think the causes are different, and I think the implications are very different. I don't think that the populist turn was a product of neoliberalism. I think it was a product of state weakness. And state weakness is a constant in Latin America, particularly in the Andes, and doesn't change with, you can give or take neoliberalism, you can give or take the commodities boom. State weakness persists. And for that reason, I think that populism will very likely persist. The 3 conditions that I laid out, which may be wrong, but that I laid out, inequality, weak parties, and weak states continue to exist, which I think that even without the commodities boom, and with or without neoliberal policies, you will have conditions for populism going into the future. I mean, with the changing global domestic economic circumstances, clearly the space for statist economic policies, for left-of-center economic policies is reduced. And that's for, those constraints exist for populist governments, and those constraints exist for non-populist governments, for social democratic governments. So, you know, in the absence of the commodities boom, with 1 or 2% growth and moderate commodity prices, social democratic parties like the Frente Amplio can do less, or the PT if they ever return to government. It's going to be a little while, and populist governments like Morales can do less. They're more constrained. But I think it's just important to make a distinction between populism and leftism. The left has always existed, throughout the democratic period, since 1982. There's always been a left, but in the worst of economic circumstances, when there's literally no money, like the 1980s, early 1990s, left governments inevitably either they crash and burn, like Alan Garcia in Peru, or they govern as center-right, like the MIR did in Bolivia in the late 1980s, or the Izquierda Democrática did in Ecuador in the late 1980s, early 1990s. The left continues to exist, it's just more constrained.
Thank you. Magnus?
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I was thinking about, you have been speaking about populism in a very personalistic sense, that is the first leader coming in from the outside. I'm thinking about populist movements, Chavismo, Peronismo, APRA. Take Maduro, for example. Is he a populist? He's clearly the establishment. He's not coming from the outside. Mm-hmm. And how about Menem in the Peronist movement? And how about the concept of populist movement? Is that something that you don't believe in? Is it only the first leader that is a populist? Or how about the rest?
It's a great question. I mean, in the United States, going back to this question of American populism a century ago, you did have what were seen as populist movements. The original version of Russian populism back, again, a century ago, where it's sort of rural populist movements. And one could certainly argue that the MAS in Bolivia is a populist movement. So I think they're relatively rare, but I think it's theoretically possible to have. So I kind of cheat, and I argue in my definition that populism is usually characterized by a personalistic leadership, not always. It usually is personalistic. Now the movements, the post-populist parties, the parties that are legacies of populism, Peronism, Chavismo today, Fujimorismo today, you can say it's a populist party. What it really is a former populist party. It's a party that was given life, that was engendered by a populist leader, that really in most cases is no longer populist. Peronism has not been populist for a very long time. It's a political machine. It's a political machine that with strong support among the poor. APRA, it's been a long time since APRA was a populist party. I don't think Maduro is a populist. Maduro inherited a populist movement, and Chavismo was born of populism, but it's harder to call it populist today. So, I mean, a lot of people argue that because populism is so personalistic and so anti-institutional, most people, at least in the United States, tend to assume or believe or claim that populism is antithetical to party building. That you've got, these populists like Perón hated parties. Keiko Fujimori herself told me that her father hated parties. Populists tend to hate parties, but actually, in many cases, they build strong parties. Sometimes by accident, sometimes in spite of themselves, because they polarize society, they mobilize. When they're very successful, like Perón, like Chavez, like Fujimori, they create strong partisan identities among their followers. Those are the raw materials for a strong political party. So Peronism became one of Latin America's most successful parties, despite the fact that Perón hated parties. Chavismo is the same way. Fujimorismo is the same way. Not quite as successful. So, but I would not, those are parties of populist origin.
Okay.
I would not characterize them as populist.
Okay, it's myself, and then we have two more questions, and then we close the list. Well, thank you very much, and I really liked very much of your definitions. This ethno-nationalist populism in comparison with Latin America and Trump, United States, I think was very good, and the issue of state weakness. I totally agree with that. But I don't know, you say that you don't like to speak in terms of black and white and so on, but you do. There is a negative bias here on populism that you have, and there is a norm. The norm is liberal democracy. The thing is, what happened when the norm fades? What happened when the norms equalize with corruption, elitism, exclusion, including racism, which is in Latin America is a particularly difficult. The case of Venezuela could be something like that. And populism might be a way out of this negative liberal democracy structure that might perceive so by large parts of the population. So in that sense, might populism be good for the system? And I think I understood the question of Laclau on Mouffe, because that is one of the points. And you use the word people in English, but Laclau would use the word pueblo in Spanish, which is not the same thing as people in English, right? As an element of inclusion against this consensus, which is negative for democracy.
Look, I think ultimately that is a normative question. So I want to be very clear. My dependent variable, what I'm trying to explain, is the stability of liberal democracy. That's an important question because most existing countries in Latin America are liberal democracies. You can like them, you can hate them, you can be indifferent to them, but they're the predominant existing regime in Latin America, and whether they persist or fail, I think, is an important social science question. I personally am a believer in liberal democracy. One does not have to be a believer in liberal democracy to ask this question. It's a normative question as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Really, I don't care very much about what your personal normative belief about the value of the persistence of liberal democracy is. We can disagree. You may think a populist destruction of liberal democracy is a good thing. I may think it's a bad thing. It's still an important question. And so I'm trying to ask, even though there is a normative element to this, I think you can ask the same question no matter whether you're an adherent of liberal democracy or not.
Okay, thank you. Over there, behind you, first.
Okay.
First,
okay.
him, yeah.
So, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. I have one question for you. Some of you described, you paint a picture where populism is a move of desperation, so to speak, because of the weak state. You have the social inequality. You have the whole idea behind that. And I can describe it because I'm familiar with it, because my home country, Greece, is one of those cases, right? And we can see those characteristics that you've been describing, but we haven't seen a move to an competitive authoritarianism, as you say. What would you say is the reason they haven't made the jump? Because Tsipras obviously had the 70% in his referendum against the European Union. He obviously had the whole anti-establishment idea. He had the weak state that Greece is because of corruption and so on. So what would you say is why didn't Greece make the jump over to comparative? Or maybe you maybe have the idea that it has already made the jump, but we haven't realized it.
No, not. That's a great question. So that points to Southern Europe are, I think, great examples of populist movements. Okay. I'm not 100%. I'm not an expert on these cases, but Podemos, Syriza, Five Star Movement in Italy are all movements that are they're less personalistic and they're really social movement based, and they're considered by many to be populist movements. And I think that's a reasonable characterization. Those are pretty good examples of what I would call a populist movement. I don't think we know enough that and so that deviates a little. They're much more bottom up, much more collective, much less personalistic than the populist movements that I'm describing in Latin America. So one possibility, I don't know the answer to your question. One possibility is that these sort of bottom-up populist movements have a different impact than top-down personalistic populist movements as I described them in Latin America. The other possibility is that Southern European democratic institutions are just considerably stronger. Or maybe it's a mix of the two. But I don't think Greece has slid into competitive authoritarianism at all. And I mean, in part, it's a coalition government. It's a pretty different dynamic. But yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a great answer to it.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation as well. So I have a question which I'll try to make short. With the idea is that can we drive back populism by strengthening state institutions? And is that can we drive back populism or like decrease the chance of the populistic leader coming to power by strengthening the state institutions? Because that would you say that is like the main difference to Western populism? That like this is exactly what's the difference between Western populism that we see in Southern Europe, for example, and populism in Southern or Latin America, where we have comparatively the weak institutions, following like the idea of there are now some movements that like institutions are responsible for the strength of the state.
I'm not sure I understood the very last point about.
We can skip out the last part. I mean, Simoglu made that thing that the power of the state is within its institutions.
Okay, so I'm not. So what the phenomenon that's emerging in Southern Europe, I think, has to be identified as populist in some way. I'm a little bit less sure, and mostly because I'm so ignorant of it, but I'm less sure about right-wing parties, anti-immigrant parties in Northern Europe. I know they're called populist parties. I know there are some elements of populism to their appeal. I'm not entirely persuaded that it's the same phenomenon. Let's assume, though, that it is. I think that the causes of populism in Latin America are very, very different from those in the advanced industrialized countries, what you said. I do think that if I could wave a wand and make one structural change in Latin America that would sort of reduce the likelihood of populism, it would in fact be strengthening of state institutions. State institutions that work, that's a variable that I think would matter a lot. I think it's not an accident that you have less populism in Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, even Argentina, even Argentina. They have states that minimally function. I think that, and there's, anyway, so I think that state, and obviously state weakness is not what's driving populism in the United States or in Europe. The one thing that the two regions share in common, and the one sort of impulse to populism in both places at a very high level of abstraction is this perception that the entire political elite is not listening to us. In Latin America, I argue that it's a combination of state weakness and inequality that you get this perception among poor people that the political elite is not responding to our demands, to our needs. In part, it's this enormous social gap between voters and politicians, but in part, it's the fact that these even in cases of relatively well-intentioned technocrats, bureaucrats, governments, they can't deliver they can't deliver public goods very well because the state doesn't work. And that generates this perception that the elite doesn't care about us. In Europe, there is a similar perception for totally different reasons. I mean, you have this you've had this consensus between established center-right and center-left. This is true in the UK and US as well as continental Europe for the last 30 years behind two things, right? An embrace of globalization and free trade and a tolerance or openness towards immigration. And I don't know about Europe. In the United States, a majority of the people support both of those things. But about 30 to 35% of Americans don't like free trade and don't like globalization and don't like immigrants. And they feel totally legitimately that both parties ignored them. Because ever since Bill Clinton, the Democratic Party has been equally pro-globalization as the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, until Donald Trump, there was not a single faction that opposed immigration. Reagan was pro-immigration. So both parties, as different as they were, and this is true of labor and conservatives in Britain, it's true in Germany, it's true in France, largely true in Sweden, that center-right and center-left converged on those two very important issues since the early 90s. And so you have a sector of the electorate that concludes that the entire political elite doesn't represent them, is not listening to them. You throw in the problem, the additional problem or responsiveness problem created by the EU, which the United States doesn't have. But so in that sense, it's similar, in the sense that people perceive that the entire elite is not responding to them. But in a more concrete sense, the causes seem very, very different to me.
Okay, well, that was the last question. Thank you very much, Steve Levitsky. Thank you to Therese Gustafsson. And for all of you who participated here, thank you and welcome again.
Thank you for the questions.